I just want to go back to this thing I've talked about a few times before about, well, a couple of things really. Firstly, the evolutionary value of having this thing called a self. The second thing is this idea of objects and how we use metaphors for objects when we talk about certain concepts. And thirdly, this idea to do with binary decisions, how we tend to make we tend to divide the world into kind of Aristotelian categories of yes, no, good, bad, all those kind of things. And particularly the binary decision I was talking about a couple of days ago, when I was talking about how we define ourselves in terms of binary choices. So if someone says, are you an atheist, you say yes or no, usually. If someone says, are you a man, you say yes or no, and so on. So I just want to try and draw some connections between those three ideas. The first thing, which is to do with the value of this thing called a self. I spoke about that in a previous video, and what I was saying there is that if we were going to design a human being from scratch, this kind of complex organism that has to function in all kinds of different environments, and particularly has to function in all kinds of different social environments, setting up interactions with different kinds of people, interactions that persist over time, interactions that are often asynchronous. They require really quite complex organising principles to maintain their integrity. If I was going to design one from scratch, as I say, I would probably build in something like a self, something that coheres that that multiplicity of agendas that a human being has to service, and that acts as a kind of central point of reference for all these, as I say, all these ideas. It's something you can kind of come back to, a narrative centre of gravity, or a sense of a continuing personality, or a sense of ownership, those kind of ideas. So that's the first thing. We have this idea of a self. The second thing is to do with objects. I've talked about objects before, and again, largely I've spoken about them in terms of two words. Partly about what I think of as a kind of prototypical object, because objects are all different kinds. There's a remote control for this old VCR I've got here. That's an object. My hat is on the table over there. That's an object. The chair is an object. A bunch of flowers is an object. Clouds an object. So all these different kinds of objects. But some of them are kind of more prototypically object-like than others. A cloud is an object, undoubtedly, but when you get close to it, it kind of disappears. You can fly straight through it. It only appears as an object from a distance. So if we were to think about what a typical object was, or a prototypical object was, we probably wouldn't name a cloud. We'd probably name other kinds of objects, which are more, as I say, more typical, more prototypical. And those tend to be the objects which have very particular qualities. They persist over time. They're not completely evanescent. Like the steam coming from a kettle, we don't usually think of that as an object. A typical object persists over time. It doesn't change greatly in shape or in size or in form. And it has very clear boundaries. That's another thing about an object. It has very clear boundaries. Objects which are more diffuse, we tend to think of as less object-like. I'm just trying to think of an example of that. A mountain. A mountain is an object, undoubtedly, but there's no clear point where the mountain stops and the foothills begins, or the mountain ends and the plain on which this mountain rises begins. It doesn't have that clear boundary that divides what it is from what it isn't. And I think for that reason we think of a mountain as less like an object than a rock or the remote control from this VCR player. So that's the second thing, to do with boundedness. And I think when we think of ourselves, I can just refer to that first point, when we have this idea of a self, which through evolutionary processes has developed to act as this kind of organising principle, we think of that self as an object. And we talk about it as if it's an object. We refer to it as ourselves, as if we were objects. We consider the word self as a noun. It features as an object in terms of language. So it's a kind of object. It's a hypothetical object or a metaphorical object, but we still talk about it as if it was an object. And because it's an object, and because the demands on the self are to be coherent and to persist in the best way, we would try to think of ourselves, I think, as the most prototypical kind of object. We would have a tendency to think of ourselves and the self more generally as aspiring to the condition or approximating the condition of a prototypical object, i.e. one that persists over time, so we don't feel ourselves changing. We feel uncomfortable with the idea that we're changing greatly over time. One that's relatively solid. We don't like the idea of falling apart. We consider that a sign of dysfunction when we fall apart into smaller objects. We like to think of ourselves as unitary and coherent. And finally, this last thing, we like to think of ourselves, I think, as having relatively clear boundaries in the way that prototypical objects have clear boundaries. And I don't just mean the boundaries of the body, I mean the body of who we are as a self, as a person. And when we feel ourselves perhaps under the influence of drugs or under the influence of some kind of spiritual practice or some kind of, any kind of malfunction, let's say, when we feel that self breaking down, it can be disturbing and worrying. It can be elevating as well, but it can be disturbing. So we like the idea of a self that's got rigid boundaries. Like an object, like a prototypical object has rigid boundaries. And finally, if I can get to this point, this part of the idea of rigid boundaries is like an Aristotelian category. There's a very clear cut-off point between what is the object and what isn't. In this remote control, up to the boundary it's the object. Yes, 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 no. There's a very clear cut-off point between what constitutes the object and what does not constitute the object. And there's no fuzziness, there's no diffusion, there's no uncertainty or ambiguity around the edges of a prototypical object. And if we aspire to the condition of that, or if we like a self that has something like that condition, we would also like that to have similarly clearly defined boundaries. And those boundaries in kind of discursive terms, I think, are marked by the answers we give to those binary questions, or marked by the binary structure that we give to those answers. So, am I an atheist? Yes. Am I a woman? No. There's no dividing line. There is a dividing line. There's no fuzziness around the outside in my conception of myself and what a self is, which it's probably not completely accurate. I mean, certainly when I was talking about beliefs and theism and atheism and superstitions a couple of days ago, it's very clear that that's not really how I function. I like to think of myself as coherent and object-like and solid and permanent and robust and prototypical, and I will answer questions which support that, so I will undoubtedly say I'm an atheist. But I know that part of this kind of kludgy brain that I've got is also doing things which lie outside of that boundary, which is fuzzy, but I kind of deny those and repress them, I suppose, sometimes. Anyway, I hope that makes some kind of sense.